Today, mortgage stress and COVID. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, one that is post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. In today's show, I want to discuss an important correlation that I've noticed looking at my latest household surveys and specifically at mortgage stress, and that is that the high levels of COVID are actually sitting in the same postcodes as the highest levels of mortgage stress. And there is a very strong linkage because a lot of people in mortgage stress have no choice but to try and continue to work whilst they may still be ill, and indeed quite often are in multiple part-time jobs which require them to move around a lot. Now, I want therefore to spend a bit of time today going through the mortgage stress information in more detail, and to do that I'm going to replay a segment from my recent live stream when I went through mortgage stress in considerable detail. And just a reminder that I define mortgage stress in cash flow terms. This is money in versus money out. In other words, are they bringing enough money into the household each month to cover all the commitments, including paying the mortgage or indeed paying the rent if they're in a rental setting. Now, just quickly, for those who perhaps haven't been involved in these conversations before, this is my core market model. Very important to understand that I don't just make stuff up. This is based off survey information and modelling. We survey households all the time, 52,000 households, put them into the core market model, and that allows us to slice and dice the data. We can look at it through various dimensions, from location through to different segments. And we can look at property information and other financial information and a bunch of other stuff around our households. And we can also think about the scenarios and how that plays out ahead of time. Very important at the moment because, of course, there are so many moving parts to what's going on. And we can also then look at mortgage stress, price trajectory information, the buying and selling intentions, the migration statistics, the economics, CPI, wages and employment, bung it in the core market model through our scenarios. And that gives us a view of price movements, projections, ideas of where things might go at a postcode level or rolled up to state, regional, Australia level. And these are indicative only, but it gives you a bit of a flavour of what I'm seeing. Now, let me turn to mortgage stress. And unfortunately, it's moved up again to 41.7. It was 41 and a bit before. Not dramatically higher, but significantly higher and nevertheless. And the latest data from the RBA showed that the household debt ratio was now up to 180.9, so it's moving back up again. And you can see the trend there. It did come down, and that's of course because interest rates dropped, and people repaid a lot of mortgages earlier on. That's now turning around. The average mortgage is a lot bigger than it used to be. And we can look in detail at the latest statistics. This is July. And I will just point out a few statistics. I'm not going to spend long on this because we could spend the whole of showing it, but this is the interesting one. New South Wales stress 40.15 compared with 38.62 last month. Now that's quite an interesting jump insofar that we had 418,000 and it's now 444,000 households registering mortgage stress. Now, just to be clear, I register mortgage stress when people's cash flow is negative. In other words, money coming in isn't sufficient to cover their outgoings and their mortgage. Now, that's a relatively broad way of thinking about it, but if you think of it in cash flow terms, if you don't have enough money coming in to cover all your costs, sure, you can draw down on deposits, you can potentially pull on credit. But if you don't have those, then you've got an issue. And if you keep doing that, then you get into financial difficulty. So that shift is quite significant in terms of the relative movement between June and July, and it's all down to the lockdowns. In terms of some of the other states, Tasmania is still there at 56.5, and interestingly, you can see that's gone up from 50.16 to 56.5, and that's from 43,680 up to 40. So from 43 in July was 41 in June. So you can see there that there's quite a big move up. And pretty much wherever you look, actually, you can see there that the numbers are looking pretty troublesome. Apart from WA, WA had 40% of households in stress in June. In July, that was down to 39.57, so it had dropped a bit. And in terms of numbers, just over 200,000 there. Just over 200,000 there. And that was 198. So the point to make here is that there are more people who are actually holding properties, and the total number rose, but the percentage dropped slightly. So that's due to the fact that more people are taking a mortgage, and that's all to do with those stimulus packages. Now, if you look at rental stress, it's not particularly positive either. 38.8% of households in mortgage stress, compared with 37.96%, so a small rise, and pretty much across the board. Investor stress is at 25% this time around, compared with 25.9%. So not a lot of difference, and that's because there has been a little bit more uptake of some rentals, and some investors have been able to shed people with paying low rents and getting people paying slightly higher rents. But the overall financial stress metrics, which is the indicated amalgamation of all of those categories, is sitting at 39.34% of households, compared with 39.45%. So not a huge amount overall, but these patches, particularly of mortgage stress in Sydney, is very significant. Now, if I then look at it by segment, just quickly, there's no real dramatic change, but again, you can see there that in terms of mortgage stress, younger families have the highest level of mortgage stress at 78%. We also have some other groups, the battling urban and the disadvantaged fringe. And then we have a few others as well there, which are not necessarily doing that well. And if you look at it in just pure number terms, I keep having to highlight this point, we do see a lot of suburban mainstreams. In fact, the largest group in terms of mortgage stress, disadvantaged fringe at 422,000, but look, suburban mainstream 231,000, just a little bit behind the 247,000 of young growing families. So it is significant and widespread. It's a tapestry, as I keep saying. If we then look at the mortgage stress by top postcodes, and I've just sorted them, this is sorted by the number in stress rather than the percentage in mortgage stress. And you can see there that we've got Western Australia at the top of the list, then Narra Warren, then Toowoomba, then Berwick and Harkaway, then Ballarat, then Pakenham, Mount Annan, Cranbourne, Derwent, and so it goes on. So most of these are high-growth, new development suburbs where there's been a lot of new development, where there's a lot of new land and home packages still being sold, and a lot of people with large mortgages, often first-generation migrants, and often struggling with those repayments. So in a way, not a lot of change, but also just repeating what I've seen before in terms of where the problems are. If I then go to rental stress, and again, it's pretty much same old, St George's Basin, those areas on the south coast, definitely a significant area, big area of course, but then Surfers Paradise up in Queensland, then Wentworthville and Westmead over in Western Sydney, then Toowoomba, and so it goes on, Mount Druitt, West Gosford up in the central coast, and then coming into Sydney, so around Millers Point and Dawes Point and Haymarket around there, significant number there, and so it goes on. And again, it's sorted by the number in rental stress. And rental stress is significant insofar that a lot of people who are renting are actually in fragmented part-time jobs. And what that basically means is that when the lockdowns happen, those jobs disappear. And they could be waiting at tables, or they could be doing part-time retail work. They just disappear. And that's what we see quite a lot of. So there's a lot of stress close into the centres of towns. And interestingly, some people now have decided to move back with parents, and we are seeing a number of renters giving up and just moving in. So that's another factor to bear in mind. Interesting to see when the ABS is run on the 10th of August, and we get the results later in the year, what the multi-household story is. Have we seen a significant migration into multi-generational properties? It'd be interesting to get that data. If I then look at the stressed investors, again, this is where the properties are, not necessarily where the investors live, but you can see there that central Melbourne is a real problem. A lot of vacant properties there, as is up in Queensland as well. So it does vary a little bit, but again, you can see places like Surrey Hills and Darlinghurst. You can see also places like Paradise Point in Queensland and Southport in Queensland, interestingly. A lot of interesting situations there. A lot of people have bought investment properties up in Queensland, but they're not necessarily getting what they thought they were going to get in terms of the returns. And interestingly, of course, we're finding that some people there are also struggling now with the lockdowns and with the lack of ability to pay rents. And places like St Kilda and South Bank are very much on the map as well, so close into the centre of towns, and we're seeing that both in Sydney and Melbourne. If I then go to look at financial stress, which is the sort of top-level aggregate measure, you can see there that Toowoomba sits there at the top, then central Melbourne, then we've got Mount Druitt, Western Sydney, and then we've got Hoppers Crossing and Point Cook and Werribee, Cranbourne, so those high-growth corridors, Narre Warren, places like that. Then we've got Tamworth there as well, then Greystanes, Blacktown, Ballarat, Belvedere Park, West Gosford. So the point is, you can see that some of the same names keep popping up, but you can also see how it does vary a little bit by different category. But the overall story here is there are still households who are really struggling with the flows of cash and the demand on their ability to pay for their mortgage and their rent and everything else. And more property investors in my surveys are still thinking of listing their properties and trying to get out while they can, thinking that maybe prices won't be rising so much ahead. So that's the other factor to bear in mind. Now, we can just briefly look at some stress mapping, which is something that I do quite like to do. So here is the mortgage stress. Now, today I'm showing the stress data by count rather than by percentage. It just gives you a different view, and you can see there that the bluey ones are the lowest counts and the orangey and reddy ones are the highest counts. So we'll just pull out a little bit from the centre of Sydney, and you can see there that around the harbour, well, there are a few areas like around Bondi Beach and Randwick where there's a bit more stress. Not dramatically so, but a bit around more in Mossman. Then we got to Lane Cove and Willoughby, places like that. Whereas closer in, it's not quite as bad. Some of the inner suburbs doing okay. But then if you pull out a bit further, and this is where it gets really interesting, right? I want to pull out to those areas that are actually locked down at the moment. So places like Fairfield. Because I want to draw your attention to this rather important point, that there is a very significant correlation between some of the higher stressed areas and those where there are more people with the virus. And I think it's connected, because I think that people are actually having to work to try and keep their heads above water. And the numbers we're talking about, around here and close to Campbelltown and Fairfield are big numbers. You can see there that it's 8,000 and above here. You can see that the others are slightly lower. But that's a very significant factor which I think people should be conscious of, right? This is definitely, there is a correlation, and you can see it standing out quite clearly on the map as you pull out a bit further. I also make the point that Campbelltown is also there as well, and that may be no great surprise. So that's where a lot of the pressure is. And a lot of that pressure is to do with multiple migrants coming into the area, lots of home and land packages, lots of high growth corridors, lots of people in part-time fragmented work, and in many cases also quite large families too. So all of those factors are in play. Now, I will do the same thing just over for Melbourne, just to give you a little bit of a relative view. And again, we'll start in the centre of town. Let's get rid of that. And we'll pull out a little bit. And you can see a somewhat similar story insofar that closer into Melbourne there are a few areas. Some of the Docklands areas in Port Melbourne, a bit more pressure. But as you pull out, you can see that if you go north, up towards Moonee Ponds and Moonee Valley, you've got issues, and if you pull out further, you start then seeing the same trends. You start seeing the more orangey, reddy things going on. And if you pull out even further, you can again see the old problem of those high growth corridors around Wyndham, and even down here in the Dandenongs and beyond there as well. So there's some interesting correlations once again, and the large numbers of households we're talking about here are pretty significant. Right, I'm just going to do one more on the stress view, which is, let's go to 6,000. Okay, so I'm now in Perth, and again, the story here is not quite as bad, but again, the point I want to make is there are some pockets, like Churchlands, for example, where there are more people registering cash flow issues. And I had an interesting discussion with a couple of journalists writing on the West, and they well, how can that be? How can these people up here, these are more relatively well-off people? Well, the point is they're highly leveraged. They've got large mortgages, and their incomes are not really up to servicing the mortgage at the moment. As you pull out, again, you can see the high numbers. And there are some where, like Cottesloe, Peppermint Grove, not too much of an issue in terms of the numbers. But if you go to Wanneroo up north, that's a real hot spot. And some of those new growth corridors, again, the same issue. And if you go south, you can see some of the same things there too. So it sort of tells the story quite powerfully, in my view, as to what's going on. North and south of Perth, the numbers of households with difficulty, even in the West, even in where the lockdowns aren't really very strong, are actually quite significant. Now, I will just switch quickly to rental stress. Sorry, that's investor stress. Let's go. Whoops. I was going to do that one. Rental stress, there you go. So just quickly, this is New South Wales. You can see a lot of rental stress right in the centre of town. That's because, of course, there's a lot of people renting close in. And as you come out, you can see that there are some hot spots. You can see the Bondi area again showing up. Some rental stress over in the west, but not as much as in the mortgage stress belts. Not so good perhaps coming south, but then as you pull out a bit further, you can see the same old coming up again. And it is a bit of a similar pattern. So where is the rental stress worst? Places like Blacktown. Go down towards Liverpool, that sort of area there. And you can see Fairfield in the middle, but it's surrounded by these high rents areas. And so once again, there is a correlation between what we're seeing in terms of lockdowns and what we're seeing in terms of numbers. And I think that's quite significant. Now, I can do the same in Melbourne, just because it's quite useful to make that comparison. Okay. So if we pull out Victoria 3000, we have issues in that sort of central business district block. If you pull out around Docklands, you can see that they've got issues there, Port Melbourne, and so it goes on. And once again, if you pull out to a wider view, you can begin to see precisely the same issues, both to the areas to the east and to the west of Melbourne. But this is a very interesting comment. You can see here this massive splurge of rental stress in Wyndham. And so that means that there are property investors who are really struggling, not surprisingly, simply because the rentals are not being paid because the people can't afford to pay them. So there is a pretty strong correlation in my analysis of some of those things. And unfortunately, mortgage stress is continuing to go higher. And as I say, it's concentrated very much in areas where the COVID infections in New South Wales are also very high. And I think this brings us to a really important conclusion, and that is that mortgage stress and COVID are linked. And there is a demographic and financial impact to COVID, which isn't generally being recognised in the mainstream. It's true from this analysis that there are particular groups in particular locations who are particularly under financial pressure, and frankly, the current government support that exists is insufficient to solve that problem. So, my argument is this: if you really want to address COVID, then you need to be providing more support to these households, because without it, they're forced into making decisions which are probably adverse for their health and community health, just simply to try and to make ends meet. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.